fallacy. Danielle Hawa Tarigha is a passionate leader in the economics and public policy space, looking to grapple with one of the world's oldest and most widespread issues, poverty. She studied economics at the University of Chicago and has expanded her reach into the fields of investment banking, public policy, information technology, and asset management on her mission to tackle extreme poverty. Throughout her work, she has received such honorable distinctions as the first undergraduate Rising Star Award in the Trot Business Program and her status as a Kimpton Fellow. When she's not addressing extreme poverty, you may find her updating her fun, fashion-focused Instagram account. I'm here for that. Her book, Uplift and Empower, A Guide to Understanding Extreme Poverty and Poverty Alleviation, is the reason we're here today. So please join me in welcoming Danielle Hawa Tarigha.
Hello, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Hopefully can everyone see the, yes, I believe so. Oh, okay, sorry about that. I think it's, yeah, perfect, okay, sorry about that. So hi everyone, thank you so much, Cara, for the introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Danielle, and I'm a recent graduate from the University of Chicago, where I studied economics with a specialization in business, but I also recently published my first book, which is why I'm here speaking with you all today. My book, Uplift and Empower, is a guide to understanding extreme poverty and poverty alleviation, and my goal is really to encourage more people to think about poverty alleviation in a different way by shifting their mindsets, but I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. So just to give a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to start off by answering the question, what is poverty? What did I even write about in the first place? From there, I'll describe what the poverty index is. Then I'll talk about the Money Plus method, which is actually the poverty alleviation solution framework that I propose in Uplift and Empower. And I'll wrap up by sharing a little bit about how you can personally help to alleviate poverty in your community. So, what is poverty? Well, it's important to understand that there are actually different types of poverty. Of course, Uplift and Empower is about extreme poverty in particular, but I'm actually going to start off by talking about relative poverty. So relative poverty is poverty that is dependent on the income level and assets of the people around you. Relative poverty explains why a person may feel poor, even though materially they're actually not poor. In this relative poverty, in this relative poverty realm, you can consider your comparison to people in your neighborhood or your city or your state or your nation as a whole, and that is that's how you perceive your poverty. In contrast, is actually absolute poverty, where regardless of whether or not you feel poor in comparison to the people around you, you'd be considered poor if you meet the threshold. This is poverty that's defined by official poverty levels, and it's determined independent of comparisons to other people. And then lastly, we have extreme poverty. This is defined by the United Nations as living on less than $1.90 per day. Now, why $1.90? Because this is the average of national poverty lines from 15 different low-income countries, with the general idea being that if you're living on less than that threshold per day, you'd be considered poor regardless of where you're located. Now, quick question for the audience, just to make sure people are awake. How many people do you think live in extreme poverty globally? A, 540 million people, B, 640 million people, C, 740 million people, D, 840 million people, or E, 1 billion people. And you can go ahead and put your answer into the chat. And hopefully I can access those answers. Let's see. Someone who's guessed E, okay. Give it a minute to let other people chime in. So far we have E. Does anyone else want to guess? Okay. Well, I'll reveal the answer now. Thank you to Paige for participating. And the answer is 740 million people and counting. And while this number is large, the most important part of it is actually the and counting part that I wrote in small font underneath it. And that's because of something called the static fallacy, which is the idea that you assume that the number of people living in poverty is fixed, so that simple solutions like only giving money will bring an end to poverty, where in reality, these numbers are constantly shifting and changing. People are constantly falling into poverty and escaping poverty. So it's important to recognize that when you see a large number like 740 million people, that's not one set figure, that's constantly shifting and changing, which is why this issue should be top of mind. Now, why should you care though? Why should you care about poverty specifically? Poverty's been around for millennia, so what makes poverty these days more pertinent? Well, in April 2020, the World Bank gave out a very concerning statement. They said that the ongoing crisis will erase almost all of the progress made in the past 5 years. The World Bank estimates that 40 million to 60 million people will fall into extreme poverty in 2020. Now I share this and it is concerning, and unfortunately between August, when I initially published my book, when there are about 700 million people living in extreme poverty, to December, the new number is of course 740, as I shared. That number has increased substantially because of COVID-19, but I still have hope. And why is that? Because from the 1990s until now, over 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. So we've done this before, we can do it again, and now we have the benefit of hindsight to help us lift out these additional people out of extreme poverty as well. And I'll even share how much these numbers fluctuate over time as well. When I initially started writing my book in October of 2019, the amount of people living in extreme poverty was a little bit under 590-ish million people. By February, the number had increased to 600 million. And of course, as you saw, the number has now increased. So these numbers are constantly changing over time, but now we understand what methods work to help eradicate poverty and alleviate poverty in individual areas. And we can use that knowledge to move forward in a more positive direction. So you may be wondering, why can't we just give away more money when it comes to alleviating poverty? Isn't that the most direct way to alleviate poverty? If poverty is about things that we lack, why can't we just give away more money? Well, because poverty is about more than money. As you saw in earlier slides, there are actually different types of poverty. And fundamentally, poverty is about a lack of something that an individual feels that they need. So in this context, poverty is about more than just money. It's about a multitude of things, but I won't give away the answer just yet. That's where the poverty index really comes in. And again, you're not off the hook just yet. Second question for everyone. What factors, if they're lacking, do you think contribute to a person living in poverty? Nutrition, school attendance, sanitation, housing, or all of the above? And again, you can go ahead and answer in the chat. It's important to consider the fact that poverty is fundamentally about a lack of things that an individual thinks they need. So what are some things that you think an individual would need that would contribute to a person living in poverty? And you go ahead and answer in the chat once again. Oop, I think someone's answered. Oop, that was from the last question. You can choose one of the answers that are on the slide, propose something different if you'd like. Okay, I think everyone's a bit shy, so I'm gonna go ahead and move forward. So if you answered all of the above, you are correct in this context. And this is where Oxford Multidimensional Poverty Index really comes in handy. Oop, I think someone answered in the end. Yes, okay. Anyway, so in 2010, Oxford developed the Multidimensional Poverty Index, hoping to identify some of the acute deprivations that make it so challenging to live life in any form of poverty, but of course, extreme poverty in particular as well. And they divided this index into 3 parts or 3 dimensions, hence the name Multidimensional Poverty Index. And those 3 dimensions are education, health, and living standards. On the education side, you have things like years of schooling and school attendance. And health, you have areas like nutrition and child mortality. And in living standards, you have things like cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, and electricity. With the general idea being that if an individual is living in poverty and they lack any one of these things or lack access to any one of these things, their life in poverty is considered substantially harder based on the lack of access to these necessities. Now, this more nuanced perspective of poverty requires, of course, a more nuanced perspective with regards to creating solutions to poverty as well. And this is where solution concepts like the Money Plus method really come in handy. But what is the Money Plus method and what mindset inspired it? As I mentioned, the Money Plus method is a solution framework to poverty that I propose in Uplift and Empower. And the mindset that really inspired it can really be summed up quite well in this quote. Money does not have to be the beginning and end of your engagement with poverty alleviation. Your time, your knowledge, and your skills are valuable too. with the general idea being that money should not be the beginning and end of where you engage with poverty alleviation, and you should really be moving beyond it. So taking you away from just money to that money plus component. What does it actually look like in practice? When Uplift and Empower, I spent quite a while going into some of the details of the solution concept, but it's helpfully summed up through what I call a house on a rock. Of course, it's shaped in a house and it's divided into 5 nodes, and I divide some of the key characters within the poverty alleviation system through this house framework. Currently, poverty alleviation is shaped more like a funnel system where you have large kind of pools of cash that are funneled down to individuals living in poverty, and it's really centered on the world's money rather than people who are being helped. So in my house on a rock framework and the money plus solutions method, I share a new system for poverty alleviation that flips the current system on its head. So instead of focusing on the world's money, instead you're really focusing on the individuals who are in need. And at Uplift and Empower, I refer to people living in extreme poverty as Robins, and I have a detailed explanation for why in Uplift and Empower, so I won't spoil that for you, but just to give some context there. Now let's kind of dive into some of these individual nodes. And the very base of the house, the foundation of the house, you have governments and you have big guys. This is where the bulk of the funding really comes from, so it's quite fitting that the foundation of the house is rooted in the money part of the money plus solutions method. On one side, you have government. So these are, your local and national governments who contribute to public services and help to support individuals living in poverty as best they can. And on the flip side to that foundation, you have the big guys. This is, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, foundations, philanthropists, corporations, any sort of large funding sources that would be contributing to poverty alleviation efforts as well. Again, referring back to the main idea that in the money plus solutions method, of course you need money. Poverty does of course relate to a lack of money, but then beyond that, you need to move into the plus, and that's where this next level comes in. And this next level of the house, you have your people's champions and the biz. On the biz side, you have people like the NGOs, aid agencies, think tanks, any sort of on-the-ground workers who can use their specialized expertise in helping individuals in those local areas to improve their financial status. That's where the biz really comes in. They already have that background of professional experience and local knowledge. On the flip side to that, you have people's champions. And these individuals are ambassadors for their local communities, and they share the common consensus of the world's Robins in a way that ensures that everyone's voice is heard equally. Why are they called people's champions? Because they're really those individuals who have a really solid knowledge of what's going on in the community, and they're able to share that with the other nodes. But of course, there's no centralized unit of power in this framework either. So there's no worries in the context of maybe a people's champion misinterpreting the needs of the world's Robins. The Robins can then advocate for themselves as well. But when you have a people's champion, you're really able to filter through some of the groupthink, any sort of pressure and coercion that could happen from having large groups of individuals come together and try and communicate their needs. And last but not least, you have the world's Robins. These are the individuals who are living in extreme poverty, living on less than $1.90 per day. And they're the roof of the house, quite fittingly because no house is complete without its roof, with the general idea being that this model is also not complete without the opinions and perspectives and solutions that Robins propose themselves. One thing I really advocate for in Uplift and Empower is the idea that everybody is capable of solving their own problems when given their opportunities and resources. So when you keep Robins at the head and the roof of this framework, you're making sure that they're taking full control of their ability to help themselves through this framework. Now, how can you help? Where do you fit in? In that framework, I didn't necessarily have a spot for the everyday individual who is well-intentioned and wants to give back. So how can you contribute to alleviating poverty in your community and beyond that, eradicating poverty globally? Well, it's important to understand that this book is not about helping you eradicate extreme poverty. Rather than seeking to save the poor, we should really be seeking out opportunities to help people living in extreme poverty save themselves. And I emphasize this a lot throughout Uplift and Empower. And one way to do this and to shift your mindset is by prioritizing listening over teaching. Rather than assuming that your perspectives, your solutions, your state of mind can help eradicate someone else's poverty, it's important to recognize that the individual living in extreme poverty themselves has a clear picture of the situation. They know what resources are available to them. They know what problems they're facing very well because they're living through them every single day. So it's important to approach poverty alleviation from the perspective of someone who's willing to help and aid someone through the process of helping themselves, with the knowledge that they have a clear understanding of what their situation is, and even how an outside individual can come in and make a difference in their lives as well. So prioritize listening over teaching and making sure that you're learning as much as you believe you can teach and help other people as well. Now, What's a concrete way of applying this new knowledge you've gained, of prioritizing listening over teaching and making sure individuals living in any form of poverty are able to have full agency over their help and improvement in their lives overall? One way to do this is through checking your privilege. And I mean this quite literally. I share explanations of this in Uplift and Empower, of course, but I have a quick summary here just of some everyday privileges that I take advantage of and I don't even really think about sometimes. So things like consistent money for public transportation and long distance travel, fast and consistent Wi-Fi, electricity throughout my home all day, every day, hot running water for my showers, and quality education and the opportunities that I've had throughout my class and extracurricular activities. So these are just some examples of privileges that I've taken advantage of in my daily life. And I really encourage you to sit through and try to understand what privileges you have that can be applied to other people living on low incomes where you are based. One thing I really share throughout workshops and other things that I've done post-publishing has been the importance of taking your privileges, then using your community knowledge to then go ahead and take action. So going from your privileges to your community, trying to understand what opportunities and resources currently exist, and then using that local knowledge and your privilege to take action in your community and help other people in a way that's substantive and helps people help themselves. So what's next? And these slides, I've covered about 3 of 16 chapters in the book. There's a ton of information in Uplift and Empower. And when you read the book, you'll learn more about the historical context of poverty, poverty alleviation and women's rights, modern poverty alleviation strategies, and the psychological impact of growing up in poverty, along with so much more. I talk about immigration, I talk about overpopulation, I talk about more ways you can help and give back, and there's a lot of detail covered there. So I really encourage you to read through the book and learn more detail. This gives you a brief overview of some of the key terms you need to know and how to go about helping people in the future. But if you would like to learn more, I would of course encourage you to visit upliftandempower.com, where you can view the how can you help page. And on that page, I actually break down ways that you can give back to your community, even without using the book, but based on the framework of the Multidimensional Poverty Index. So you can look into areas you can donate to, places where you can learn more, and places where you can volunteer within health, within living standards, and within those 3 dimensions. So you can go through that how you can help page for more context. And then beyond that, you can also look at the about the book page to have a full breakdown of all of the different parts of the book and also different ways that you can learn more there as well. So definitely check out the website for more detail. And if you would like to order a copy of the book, but you aren't sure just yet, I'm actually in the middle of an ebook giveaway right now. January is Poverty Awareness Month. So every week this month, I'll be offering a different giveaway on my different social media platforms. This week is Facebook. So on Sunday, I'll be announcing the winner of this giveaway. It's still open. You can still join if you'd like to. And from there, I'll be doing more giveaways on my LinkedIn and my Instagram and on my Twitter as well. So definitely feel free to keep in touch, stay engaged, and you can possibly win a copy of the ebook this month. So thank you all so much for listening. I have my contact details across my social media handles and of course my email as well. So feel free to reach out with questions. And with that, we can go into Q&A and I'll leave up the presentation overview for reference.
Thank you, Danielle. I so appreciate that. And thanks for sharing your knowledge, first of all. It's like really refreshing. And what I found like so intriguing about your book and why I was excited to have you join us is what you kind of summed up in the listening over teaching, that this isn't a book about how to get people like out of throwing money at something or telling people what to do to get out of extreme poverty, but kind of really being like need-based help and like listening to someone who has a good understanding of like their own lived experience and because they're living it. My question is that, and I'll encourage folks to enter questions in the Q&A as well. My question is kind of, how did you get to that point? Like what kind of inspired that perspective for you?
That's a really great question. And I think it all relates back to what inspired me to write the book in the first place. And this was, kind of finishing up going into my 4th year of university, having had pretty much my whole life plan kind of figured out from the 3rd grade. I showed this in the book. From the 3rd grade, I had a very clear perspective of what I wanted to do, regards to like what college I wanted to go to, what I wanted to major in, what I wanted to do as a career, etc. And I was working in finance, working in what was supposed to be, the peak of this plan that I laid out for myself. But I was passing by homeless people on the street every single day. And I kept thinking, well, how is it possible that these two worlds can possibly coexist? How is it that we're living in worlds where I can be working on, $1 million, billion-dollar deal, and yet there are people living in poverty who can't afford one meal to eat on a single day? Like, how do these two worlds coexist? And that really inspired me to write. And from there, I thought back to my personal experiences as well, like thinking I was, a lower income student going to an elite university. And even though I didn't have as many resources as the other students around me, I still knew what my situation was. I knew what my capabilities were given those opportunities and resources. And I thought, well, this can't be unique to just me as an individual as a low-income student in an elite university. This must be applicable broadly as well. So it was about trying to understand, like, what are some of the personal struggles that I went through that I was able to overcome, and knowing that there are just as many driven people who may be living in extreme poverty, but just as driven, just as motivated, just as willing to improve their own lives, that just need opportunities and connections and resources to get there.
Yeah, that's a really good, I'm really glad actually that you mentioned, because we're both living in, right now we're both living in like two of the most expensive cities in the world. Like, you're in London and I'm in San Francisco. And with that comes, I can't say that about London necessarily, but we have like so many homeless neighbors in San Francisco. And it's something that, it just like the stratification of wealth is totally wild to see every day. I was wondering, what I thought was really interesting too is how the focus on Liberia in your book, and there's like the focuses on Liberia and China, and I was wondering if you could talk about that for a moment.
Sure. Well, I'm originally Liberian. My family's from Liberia. So part of the focus on Liberia was because I wanted to learn more about my family, the country's history and origin, just my background, my roots, my culture. So that kind of covers the Liberia piece. But beyond that as well, Liberia happens to be one of the poorest countries in the world. So it was quite fitting in terms of my personal connection to the country, and also in terms of a topic as well, talking about a country that has, up until recently, kind of gone through, of course, a 14-year civil war that completely ravaged the country, and economically it declined. A lot of the population, a lot of the higher skilled population left as a result of brain drain because of that civil war. There was political unrest, of course. So there's a huge kind of block of time where Liberia was in unrest. And then before that time period as well, there was the kind of a stratification within the actual population itself, where Americo-Liberians and indigenous Liberians were constantly kind of pushing and pulling within power and trying to maintain representation in government. So between the poverty faced because of civil war and the poverty that indigenous Liberians faced under the control and influence of Americo-Liberians, I wanted to share how beyond just, a lack of money, there are structural factors that contribute to maintaining poverty over time as well, and what Liberia is doing now to try and overcome some of those complexities within poverty to help alleviate it in the long term too. And then on the China side, I focus on China because China's poverty alleviation efforts over the past couple of decades now are completely unprecedented. Like, they have helped to alleviate, I can't remember the exact number now, but hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty in the past couple of decades, and that has not been seen in history before now. So I wanted to share China's precision poverty alleviation efforts to show that this is being done, and it's being done very well, and how are they going about doing it. And I won't go into the full detail. Of course, you can read more about it in Uplift and Empower, but one of the cornerstones of their method is this idea of having, these first party secretaries who go to individual communities and have conversations with individuals to learn more about their needs and what their living situations are like, and how they can help alleviate poverty within the context of those very specific environments. And I share that because, in the same way I talked about my presentation, the importance of listening over teaching, you have that happening in real time in China, and it's working very well. Going and talking to an individual, asking them what problems they face, seeing what solutions they have in mind, and then proposing those to the government has worked so well, versus trying to work the opposite way, which is imposing your solutions on someone else of how to fix it. China has shown time and time again that having conversations, that listening to people and learning from them pays off in the long term in terms of really eradicating poverty. It requires more time, it requires more effort, it requires more money, but it works in the long term. So I wanted to kind of share those two, not really contrasting countries, but the personal connection to Liberia and the struggles that they faced up until now, even that they're still working through. And on the China side, the unprecedented success of poverty alleviation efforts and what has really led to that success as well.
That's so interesting, especially like, and speaking in like very large generalities, because in the US, we often see short-term solutions to long-term problems, which is probably based on that the opposite of that model that you propose, which is like teaching over listening, which I think is really interesting when thinking about the different demographics of like China versus the US, and what like our different intersections like here in the States would look like versus like a model in China, which one of the questions that you sent to me, which I think is really interesting and a good like kind of segue to that, is why are women's rights so critical to discussions about extreme poverty?
Yeah, and I have my women's rights chapter that I shared a lot of detail kind of regarding like how these two areas intersect. But the fundamental reason why I decided to even write about women's rights in the first place is because, at first when I was writing, I thought, well, poverty should be, considered this genderless concept. It's just a social concept that we've had to deal with over time. But in reality, there are, almost half of our global population is not considered to be an equal footing with the other half. And when you see women who are heads of household, who oftentimes are providing financial support and, that at-home support, that and providing that unpaid labor that contributes billions of dollars to the global economy every single day, like that's something that needs to be spoken about. So the women's rights piece is really more recognizing the value that women add to the global economy that's under-recognized and underrepresented, oftentimes in the labor market and at home. And, there's cultural factors that play into that as well. And trying to understand what we can do as individuals to help ensure that women are treated on equal footing. Because when you sow into and invest into women, you're really investing into, their children if they happen to be mothers, and beyond that, their communities as well. Because more often than not, when you're providing aid and resources to women, you're seeing more of that results in positive outcomes for the community at large as well. So the focus there was really about showing that you cannot have substantive change to the way that we approach poverty alleviation and, access to basic necessities as a human right, and to acknowledge that women's rights are human rights as well.
Yes, absolutely. Especially if you expect women to like do all of this labor that is often unpaid, which includes raising another generation of people. I do see a couple of questions in the chat on my end. It looks they're just little icons, so I'm not sure if you want to go ahead and resubmit those questions. That might be better for us because we do want to get to them. But as my last question to you, Danielle, I'd love to hear about kind of, and I know you wrote a whole book, and it's a huge, complicated topic. And if you could tell us or summarize for us in a smaller way, a palatable way, ways to what's like a practical way or an applicable way to alleviate poverty, like what's something that we can do in our everyday lives, like action wise or otherwise.
Definitely. And I'm really happy with the way that you phrased the question as well, because I think when I started researching this issue and trying to like figure out ways to communicate my ideas, one thing that I struggled with was this whole idea of trying to, tackle everything all at once. And the pressure that I felt was to think like, well, how can you eradicate poverty globally everywhere, like simultaneously almost? And realistically, that's just not really possible, especially as an individual, who is, just like, has positive intentions, but like my level of influence and impact is small, right, in comparison to a large global organization. So what I encourage every individual to do is go through those steps that I shared in the presentation as well, right? Like check your privilege, figure out some daily conveniences that you have that you could possibly transfer to someone else from a low income. And an example of that could just be something as simple as tutoring. If you have a quality level of education, think about what resources currently exist in your community and consider for yourself, like, do you have the time to tutor on the weekends? Is that a way that you can, give back so into the life of someone who has a low income and is looking for a mentor or someone to support them and provide a level of self-confidence and skills-based training and connections that can help them move forward and encourage their financial status? It's something simple, things like tutoring and mentoring can make a huge difference over the long run. As a personal example, of kind of applying this same kind of framework in my life as well. I knew that I had the privilege of a quality level of education, I knew that in my hometown, at my local high school, there are a lot of high achieving high school seniors who needed financial support to afford college and university. I was one of those high school seniors. I knew what it was like to apply for scholarships upon scholarships upon scholarships. So I thought, well, oftentimes I found myself applying for these really competitive national scholarships, and I wasn't always successful. So why don't I provide an additional local scholarship to help support, one, at this point, even two high school seniors in my hometown. So I took that privilege of a quality education, I applied it to my local knowledge of the resources that currently existed, and then I took action. So I announced a scholarship fund in September of 2020. As of December, we recently raised $1,000. So at the end of this academic year, we'll be providing two high school seniors with $500 scholarships to my local high school. And that was a way that I took my privilege. I thought about the opportunities that existed in my community, and I took action. And I encourage everyone to do the same. Think about your privileges. They could be similar to mine or totally different. Think about what currently exists. And if there's a gap of opportunities, if there's a gap of resources, could you possibly fill that gap yourself? And if not, who do you know that possibly could? Who could you possibly work with to do that? And then from there, take action. It's really that simple. Just thinking about how you can transfer your privileges to someone else and investing more time and effort and energy into this, because it's a lot easier to, give a dollar here and there than it is to sit and think critically about how you can engage and spend more time to make substantive change over the long term. Because yes, in the short term, that dollar could, be an extra dollar put towards food, but in the long term, you need to make substantive changes that lead to structural changes in the even longer term from that as well.
Yeah, it's a great answer. And it's like, we also, even if we wanted to think selfishly, it benefits us in the long term to have educated younger people in our community. That's wonderful. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much. I'll give another moment for folks to enter questions if they have them. Looks like we do have one here. Paige says, I pass by homeless people often, and I am on very limited income for many years, but those daily inconveniences I think often. I felt stuck after studying sociology at City College of San Francisco, volunteered so far at library and food kitchens. Yes, your example, could you do video tutoring you could do video tutoring to help adults read. Pre-COVID, you could do this face-to-face. Wouldn't let me answer the second question, Danielle, but Paige has been here to support the whole time. Thank you, Paige.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and these are really great examples. Yes, of course, like video tutoring is a really great substitute given the circumstances. Volunteering at the library, soup kitchen, those are also really great ways too. And I just encourage beyond that as well. I actually share the example of a soup kitchen in Uplift and Empower in a slightly different context, but with the idea of being like, and I think it was it was a high school. The example I gave was me in high school. I went to volunteer to soup kitchen once. I never went back. So the importance of making sure that when you do go and into those volunteering environments, that you're staying there for a long enough time to make an impact and get to know the people you're helping as well. Because, going once in a while, like I was doing, was really doing more harm than good, because I didn't really know who I was helping, why I was helping. I went there because it made me feel good. But at the end of the day, it's not about like how we as individuals are feeling. It's about how the people we're helping are feeling and how they're benefiting from our volunteering, from our transferring our privilege, et cetera. So just making sure that when you do give back, you're doing so in a way that's meaningful and is that long-term investment of time, because going once or twice here and there it's helpful for you as an individual who's giving, but who are we actually focusing on? Like making sure the focus is centered on the people who are being helped. And that's kind of the same thing I share in the framework, the same thing that I kind of, really focus on when in terms of helping people to understand how they can give back as well. Is making sure the focus is placed on the individuals who are being helped, making sure your focus is placed on those Robins at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't overcommit yourself. Don't say like, I'm going to do this, once every week when you know that that's not a possibility for you. Make it, yeah, I agree 100%.
Whatever makes, of course, like your schedule, your time, just making sure actually, that's a really great point to make in terms of balance, and making sure like if you only have, like maybe 5 hours, even a month to help, give back, volunteer, et cetera, you'd almost be better off contributing to one organization for 5 hours a month than, contributing to 5 organizations for 5 hours a month and not really having as much impact as you possibly could by centering your efforts on one place and making sure you're really giving it your all when you're contributing. So definitely a great point though. Don't overextend yourself, making sure it's the quality of help versus the quantity of help as well there too.
Great. So I'd love to kind of leave on, if anyone has any questions, I welcome them now. If not, I'd love to kind of end on this question, Danielle, is how can we check in with ourselves as we work toward more meaningful solutions?
Well, actually, so I give these 4 questions in the book. I won't spoil them, and I usually leave them to be discovered in the book. But I'll kind of give a general idea of like what I say. The first is asking yourself, how can what you're doing possibly be improved? Like, ask yourself this question. Just be honest with yourself. Like, how can what you're doing in terms of giving back, in terms of volunteering, in terms of making these substantive changes, how can that be improved? Then beyond that, how do you know that you're actually helping the people that you think you're helping? Like, are there clear signs of progress being made over time, or are you just committing to this task because it makes you feel good, but at the end of the day, the change is very negligible at best? Making sure you're actually seeing the results of your change. Then from there, how can what you're doing possibly be harmful? Like, is there any way that what you're doing can have a negative effect? Are there negative consequences for what you're contributing? And if so, how do you mitigate those? And then beyond that, making sure that you're asking yourself, how can you improve in the future too? So just checking in with yourself in terms of being honest and saying, like, are there ways that you can improve? Are there things that can possibly be harmful? Could you be getting better at doing those things? Just ask yourself these questions that make sure you're reconsidering what your motivations are for doing what you're doing, and reconsidering the implications and the effects of what you're doing as well. And it's hard to be honest with yourself in that way of saying, like, oh, like, is what I'm doing possibly harmful to someone else? But it's important to ask yourself that, to make sure that looking forward, you're able to improve, make sure the quality of your help, again, that quality of your help is it's better in the long term. Because at the end of the day, it's about people you're helping, and making sure that when, maybe 12 months from now, you making an impact in that person's life has a clear difference from when you initially met them, whether it's one person or 10 or 20 or more. Making sure the quality of help you're giving is enough to see substantive changes over time. So I guess long story short, that was a long answer to your question, but long story short, just be honest with yourself and, kind of check in about the quality of the help you're giving, and asking yourself hard questions about how that help is what the actual results of that help look like.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's a great answer. And that's a really, I think it's hard to interrogate that in ourselves, and that's really necessary. And thank you for pointing that out. Also, thank you for spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge. It's so helpful. I'm really glad to be here with you today. I'm really glad everyone who joined us was able to. And Danielle's book is available at our store in person at Green Apple Books here in San Francisco. You can also order it from us online at greenapplebooks.com. That's Uplift and Empower, a guide to understanding extreme poverty and poverty alleviation. And I'll put in one other bid for Danielle's book here, which is that I think it's a really good book to read. Not only, as Danielle mentioned, it's January's Poverty Awareness Month, but it's also a new year. We had a very hard year last year, and I think it's a really good book to kind of start fresh and get a new perspective on like how to be a good neighbor and community member. And we're all in this together. I think it's a really good read for that.
Absolutely. And I talk about the importance of community a lot in Uplift and Empower. And one thing that, even just from the day I published until now, that's really been encouraging is seeing how much people have been able to, like, band together and help and support each other, even through the hard times that we're facing right now. So I do have hope for the future, in that I know that there are a lot of individuals who care and are looking for ways to provide that quality of help too. So the importance of community, I won't even stress that any more than I already do in the book itself, but I think it's so absolutely critical. And I'm seeing this higher trend of, contributing to giving back to your neighbor, contributing to your community, wanting to make a difference locally as well. And I think that's so absolutely critical to making more strides to alleviate poverty locally and, of course, globally, broadly. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Danielle. And once more, where can people find you?
Oh, so I'll go back to that slide actually for some more context. But of course, check out upliftandempower.com for more detail. I have a video about the book. I have some of my prior presentations and events on the website as well, so you can see more information there. And of course, feel free to reach out to me through social media. My handles are usually just my name. So on Instagram, it's Danielle Hawa Tarigha. My Twitter is Danielle_Hawa, not super active on Twitter. You can add me on LinkedIn if you'd like to. The Facebook page, again, we have that giveaway going on for the ebook, Uplift and Empower. So you can go to the Facebook page, Uplift and Empower, and join the giveaway there. And of course, you can email me as well, just danielle.tarigha@gmail.com. I love answering questions about the book. I love talking about it. So feel free to reach out and ask questions as they come up.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Danielle Hawa Tarigha, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.